Thank you. Today I want to talk to you about something I've come to know as uncanny wisdom. But before we get there, I'd like to point out that human beings are the most intelligent creatures on earth, with accomplishments in science and engineering, medicine, and the arts beyond the pale of any individual to understand it all. We have the ability to reason and create and retain the knowledge that we create in culture. This clearly sets us apart from all other living beings on the world, on the planet. And yet, we fail to reach a sustainable outcome. Jim Litkovich, in Salmon Without Rivers, casually remarks that sustainability is not difficult. It's not rocket science. It's a lot harder. And the truth is that we kind of know what we have to do. But the difficult decisions often do us in. These decisions lead to catastrophic events like global warming, deforestation, massive pollution, urban sprawl, and many, many more. On the road to making these decisions, these rational decisions that we have to make, are a number of obstacles that keep us from being effective. The first among them is rational behavior. Herbert Simon in 1882 got the Nobel Prize for his work on the limitations of rational behavior. He told us that we need to, one, know all the possible outcomes in advance, and two, consider all of the consequences of those outcomes, and then choose the outcome that has the best possible value. 20 years later, in 2002, Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work on human judgment and rationality. Along with Amos Tversky and a number of other people, he conducted some experiments that basically show that humans make errors that are bounded in cognitive heuristics and biases. These cognitive heuristics and biases run completely counter to the rational model that underlies economic behavior and many of the decisions that we're talking about. The illusion of control is talked about in terms of when we give a success, the chances of our success to be higher than what we would anticipate given objective facts. Elaine Langer at Harvard did a whole series of experiments where she put people in conditions of completely random outcomes and watched them attribute skill to their outcome. This is exactly one of these cases, like blowing on dice to get a particular number. Finally, the father of modern sociology, Robert Merton, basically came to the conclusion many years ago that there was this thing called unanticipated consequences, and there were three things that led to us getting these unanticipated consequences. The first was that we don't have all the knowledge we need. The second was that we failed to do the right analysis or reach the right behavior selection. And the third is that we fail we misjudge the interest in the outcomes. So some people get really anxious and make it come out their way. And the final problem I'm going to talk about today with this is that sustainable problems are very messy. And so we end up defining them as abstractions of the real thing. And that means that basically they don't fall out of the sky and bonk us on the head like an 8th grade math problem, okay? That everybody ends up defining it in their own way based on their own value system. And as we get more and more complex in these sustainable problems, the value systems get muddled together, and we don't have a clear picture of what the solution might be. Uncanny wisdom sits on the foundation of this human behavior, this human decision making, this shaky platform on which we're trying to make things happen. Uncanny wisdom occurs when humans make what seem to be rational decisions, and then it turns out that over time they start to slip away. They're less rational than they appeared. They have unintended consequences, so to speak, that makes it impossible for them to be as rational as they appeared. And in the end, society steps in with social institutions to make things a lot better, in the form of licenses, building permits, insurance, mortgages are given, and even government subsidies are awarded. For example, flooding is one of the most intense problems in the United States today. Houston has had a long, long history of flooding, with over 16 major floods prior to 1936. And in 1935, there was a huge rainfall of 16 inches of rain. It flooded 25 downtown blocks and over 100 residential blocks. It was the worst flood of its time. It was so bad that the citizens of Houston went to the legislature and petitioned them to create the Harris County Flood Control District. Can you even imagine? It's hard for me to even imagine. Independent-minded Texans asking for the government to come and help them. But they did. It must have been really, really bad. And it worked to a certain degree. The flood control district was put into place in about 1937, and by the 40s, they were building retention reservoirs around the region and channelizing the streams into the reservoirs. And it worked so well that there was, up until 1972, there was not another flood of equal magnitude to the one in 35. But in 1972, there was a vast difference between it. Instead of 16 inches of rain falling, it was just 6 inches of rain. You see, a few channels and some reservoirs were no match for the intense population growth and development going on in the area. Urban development clearly outstripped what was going on. And after 1970, development continued and the population growth continued. And this sets the stage for the $125 billion Hurricane Harvey last fall with its 40-plus inches of rain. On another subject, the first automobiles must have been a bit of an odd thing to show up on the scene, with their fumes spewing out the exhaust pipes, with their noise, with the fuel that they were burning. And then along comes Henry Ford and mass produces it so that everyone could do it, and suddenly the stage is set for it to be anywhere. It was about this time that my grandfather brought home his first vehicle. He pulled in and pulled back on the steering wheel and said, "Whoa, Nellie," and crashed right into the barn. No one was hurt. But this was just the beginning. There were a number of things that had to be worked out, like the roads need to be improved. Licenses started to be issued. Rules of conduct of who drove on what side of the road and so forth all had to be developed. And by the 20s, the dangers involved were beginning to show up, with between 10 and 20,000 deaths a year on the highway. And over the last 100 years, we've seen the improvement in safety, 24-fold improvement in safety, from just around 24 deaths per 100 million vehicle miles traveled to just 1 in 2016. A huge improvement, which also gives rise and underscores that this is the right activity, that we should continue to do it. But as more and more problems come about, it becomes more and more clear that we need to change. As I've talked about the deaths, toward the end of the century, you can see right here that there were about 40,000 deaths a year. But later on, other things start to show up, like the environmental pollution is not even in there, okay? And the obesity that leads, the lack of activity that leads to obesity and heart disease and other problems isn't in there. These are huge problems that aren't yet solved. It's taken most of 100 years to make the shift from combustion engines to motors, to electrical motors. And just now we're beginning to do that. Interestingly enough, as more and more people start driving electric cars, where are we going to get our money to rebuild our roads? Because that comes from a gasoline tax. When I was a boy, my father told me over and over and over again, never, never, never tell anybody where you catch your best fish. But I was a kid, come on. I blabbed. I couldn't resist telling my best friend not only where I'd caught the fish, but what bait I had used and how to fish it as well. The next time I went to my honey hole, there was a small herd of people standing there waiting to fish it as well. So much for that. That was gone. This is just one part of the story about fisheries. Fishery decline starts with plenty of fish. We have lots of fish here, easy catching, predictable catch, and for over 100 years, no quotas. Commercial fishermen could catch all they wanted. Wow. In the early 1860s, the decline of fisheries began to show up. And to handle it, fish hatcheries were developed, okay? And for a while, it seemed to work. Put more fish into the stream, how could you go wrong? But the fish hatcheries alone were not enough to overcome the other problems: logging, mining, agricultural industries, all of which destroyed the habitat for the fish, including the river itself. Fish hatcheries could not overcome that. Fish hatcheries, they would take fish from one river and put it into another river where it had no genetic understanding of what was going on, and expect it to work. And of course it didn't. And for over 100 years, fish hatcheries were the solution. If we put enough fish in there, it's bound to curb the decline. But then in the late 1900s, they commissioned some studies to look at the efficacy of fisheries. And they discovered that not only were they not always helpful, sometimes they made the problem worse. When we move to a new place, we have a new place to get to, it's usually, and we start developing in that place, it's usually a place that's full of nature, plenty of peace and quiet, and lots of ease all around. Plenty of fresh air, for example. And then more people come, and it turns into a less and less desirable place to be. The traffic goes up, the noise goes up, and pretty soon it's pretty traffic. And then they build commercial districts around that district and make it and close in on it until it gets even more just like the place that they were trying to get out of in the first place. And every single house that is built has assurances from society that this is the right thing to do. They get a mortgage. They get a building permit first, then they get a mortgage, and they get insurance for that house. So this is the right thing to do. And more people do it. And then along comes the traffic, gets a little bit bad. Traffic's usually one of the first things that happens. And then what happens is the local community steps in to help. Maybe your employer supplies you parking, or the community widens the roads, or maybe they get real inventive and they construct all new routes to key destinations. All of which basically ensures that this is the right thing to do and gets people to continue to do it, which means more and more people move in. Until finally you get to a place where you have to have an 8-foot privacy fence in order to feel safe in your own backyard. But the privacy fence cuts you off from all your neighbors and isolates you so that you can't create a community, okay? You may have to walk a mile to get to your neighbor's house where you can hear your children playing in the backyard from your back porch. But you can't get there from here. You have to walk all the way around all of the fences to get to those kids. So instead of walking, of course, you drive, okay? So more automobile dependence. So as you can see, uncanny wisdom has led us to some pretty unsustainable outcomes for the built and natural environment. And our responses often make the problem even worse than it was before. What we need to be doing is considering the impacts of the responses, impacts of the decisions before we actually make them. And by doing that, then revisit it from time to time to make sure that things don't get out of hand before we correct them. Uncanny wisdom, understanding about uncanny wisdom, may help us reach the idea that we know what to do and we need to take responsibility. Understanding uncanny wisdom may help us shape the world in which we live in sustainable ways. Thank you.